open up some questions that have arisen over the last couple of days. And just to introduce our panel, on the right is Jenna Burrell, who's a professor in the School of Information, who works a lot on technology, particularly the social dimensions and particularly in Africa. Paul Edwards, and also Dr. Stiegler, who's visiting from France and directs, as I said, the Institut for Research and Innovation at the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. So I just thought what I'd first like to do is open up a couple of points of contact between the two papers that we've heard over the last 2 days, and then invite Jenna as well to intervene, to talk a little bit about some of the issues that were raised today in particular. But what I'm really interested in is to start with is what Bernard might have to say about Paul's very interesting account of the technosphere and some of the relationships there between knowledge production and these greater systems, and particularly this fascinating idea of a self-repairing system. So I thought I might invite Bernard to start with a comment on Paul's paper.
Thank you. First, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. Yes, I was very impressed by the way in which you introduced this question of the atmosphere. And of course, I thought about what I said yesterday concerning exosomatization. And I just discussed now with Catherine about a concept I try to use very precautioniously because it is dangerous. That is a concept of what I call exorganisms. And when listening to what you said, I thought, of course, to Lord Locke and those questions, and I thought that IPCC is like a function in such an exorganism that the Earth could be, or the biosphere could be, and in which you talked about metabolism, in which it has a function that we should precise in relation with other functions, or what I call myself the exosomatized functions. Because we had a discussion with Catherine about, for example, the relationship between experiments or experience and simulation. And I said that if we want to address correctly these questions, we have to re-inscribe them in a global context in which we have a change of the function of knowledge itself in a kind of loop that is produced by the fact that knowledge is capable to produce new forms of exosomatized organs that themselves pose new questions to knowledge, and there is a kind of feedback loop in which we have to re-qualify completely at the epistemological level what is such an institution, for example, like IPCC, what in such an institution are, for example, the data, the massive data, etc. And I think there is a question of complete redefinition of knowledge in the sense that I call myself today a neo-functionalist redefinition. When I say neo-functionalist, it is because I believe it is not at all functionalist in the sense of behaviorism or cognitivism, but nevertheless it is functionalist. And of course there is here a problem of the problem for me in such a view is that this idea of exorganism is extremely problematic, of course. Now I think that your talk confirmed that those questions are really urgent. I'm not sure that's really relevant, but they are probably really confirmed by what you said. So I wanted to open that, but I took also some notes, so I will read them because I have all the other questions. Maybe just for putting kind of perspective about this, or the discussion of for later. When you said that the connection between the towns, for example, through a kind of chronography of the climate change, the towns, the cities, when you say, for example, this city in 40 years will have the same kind of climate than this one, etc. You describe something that is processual, in which the question is to produce anticipations, possibilities of reflection, a function of noises precisely, that is also a distributed noises. And for me it's very important because there are two or three topics that are at stake here, that I consider to be topics for the future. The first one is the locality and the role and the definition of the locality in such a process. The second one is the processuality itself, in the sense of Whitehead and Simon. Considering all those questions, for example, from the point of view of Simon, it is a process of concretization as a process of individuation, not only the individuation of a city or a country or region, but the individuation of the biosphere itself. And from the point of view of Whitehead, it is a process of concretions that is the base for thinking what he called speculative cosmology. And I think here we are, and I go back to the question I tried to answer yesterday in conclusion, we have to completely rethink what are the conditions of scientific research. And in what I try to think myself as what I call a contributory research, in which, of course, the question is how to work with the biosphere itself, with the inhabitants of the biosphere. For example, for the IPCC, in this function of the IPCC that is capable to take care, because the question is care here, to take care of the processuality itself. So here, and I finish with that, I think that when you talk about the technosphere, what is extremely important is to very precisely, and in a discussion with the disciplines, physics, meteorology, biology, astrophysics, etc., etc., to discuss very precisely what could be really such a concept like techno-metabolism. Here it is extremely interesting to read Georges Pompidou, because he produced, not in the big book in Harvard, but in a lecture he gave in France, in Strasbourg, because he taught for 3 years in the University of Strasbourg in France. And he developed a kind of theory, a very small one. It was not really a theory, but a drawing, something opening new perspectives about metabolism precisely, that are extremely interesting. For example, he asked why was it possible for USA after the Second World War to provoke with Japan a process of transfer, a metabolic process of transfer, that was not possible with other countries. And he tried to, we go back to questions like immunity, autoimmunity, etc., etc. He tried to compare between this policy of America with Japan and with Europe and with Africa. He tried to understand why it couldn't work in such a situation, why it worked in this other situation. But from a metabolic point of view, really in this sense. And I think what is interesting with him is that he thinks that with biology, not for producing a biocentric economy, but precisely for understanding that why we are not yet, we are no longer in biology, but we are confronted with questions that are solved in the sphere of biology for the body, for the living body. And so I think here there are very interesting possibilities, discussions with Georges Pompidou.
respond, I think that this is also where I think Jenna's work might come into play as well, thinking about these metabolic relationships between sort of globally unequal, often, transfers of both knowledge and technology. So I think.
I had questions about, I had questions from Paul. I wondered what you thought about, as you present this kind of global effort to model climate change, it seems like a very successful attempt, a successful effort. And I was really struck by the graphs that you were showing, and the one slide which pertains specifically to some work that I've done, which looks at the supply chain that feeds the mobile phone and then the disposal process afterwards, which was a series of juxtaposed images. And I thought a lot about what we know about supply chains and how poor that information really is. And what it is about the object of study climate change itself that perhaps allows this kind of global effort to capture and kind of convincingly argue about these trends that are worldwide. And you know, as you were talking, I was thinking about whether it has to do with the fact that a global network of collaborative scientists attached to a particular disciplinary approach who are interested in kind of constructing the same coherent object is one reason why that was so successful, or if it's something about looking at weather patterns or the climate itself that lends to that sort of effort. If we're talking about things like supply chains, which are about human social processes in part, or economic processes, that it escapes that kind of global attempt to kind of capture and model it.
Wow, these are great questions and interventions. Let me start with Ben. When I was reviewing these slides for today, and came to that word exo-information. I was thinking about your exosomatization concept. So, it seems, if I understood it correctly, is a bit like Marxism, when what was once in the body into some machine or process that's outside it. And I think it's really, in a lot of ways, just a restatement of what you said yesterday, but that is the exo-information, the kind of capture of information that we create ourselves and going about our daily lives, and then reuse of that in other forms in ways that completely escape anything any individual can even comprehend, much less change. As I think it strikes me as a fundamental process of today's information society. And Jenna, so I didn't say this during the talk, but I think I showed these two graphs, the two sets of graphs, one of Earth system processes and one of socioeconomic processes. And the uncertainties about socioeconomic stuff are much greater than anything in the physical systems that we know about. And partly it's just that they are, that what you are measuring can be contested, is much less stable in the world of socioeconomic information than in the physical sciences, though that's also contested and heavily so sometimes in places. And what do we really know about supply chains? Well, what's been interesting to me in trying to come up with examples of how information recycling could help to optimize anything on a really large scale is that I keep coming to these corporate examples. And the reason for that, I think, is just that that's where there's enough coherence and a limited enough scope that there can be some hope of a kind of really reliable, comprehensive information flow. When you try to scale it out beyond a corporation to what's happening in the whole world, it's much more difficult. But at the same time, I think we have, just as the physical world has been heavily instrumented since the 19th century, that's also true of the social world. If you think about the number of surveys that you're constantly getting in your inbox, I never take them and just refuse, there are too many. But there are thousands of instruments like that out there that are constantly collecting more and more data about us, and then of course all automatic, algorithmic ones that do it without our even knowing about it. And that's both the promise and the pitfall of socioeconomic information. There are so many, I hear all the time in the school of information where I teach, I'm sure you get this too, of people drawing conclusions about human behavior on a very large scale from Twitter and Facebook data and things like that. There's nothing in that, and yet validating that, I mean, it's at least as complicated as validating climate models, trying to figure out what the relationship is between data collected for one purpose and then used for something else, when the data sets are controlled by a corporate entity that constantly changes the conditions of access, the amount of data that one can have, so that these, the memory function that I talked about, the long-term, stable data set that you can look at again and again and constantly refine and have some sense that you're actually making progress on that. It's just gone when you have this kind of constantly shifting data from things like Twitter, Facebook, all the other social media that people like to use now to replace traditional surveys. You know, there's another kind of information practice that's becoming really common. I was just reading an article about this for a class I'm teaching, is election markets. You know, fascinating thing, because there are two ways of predicting elections: polls and then election markets. Polls, you're trying to get a representative sample that's very much like sampling the physical world. You find a bunch of things that stand in as for lots of other things. But election markets, we know, as far as I can tell with a relatively light survey of that literature, we know nothing about the demographics of the people who participate in election markets. And yet, the election markets are, if they're de-biased, are actually more accurate than polls. That's really weird, because it means that most, this is a complete guess, but I think it's probably right. I would guess that the large majority of people who participate in election markets are white males, and probably older white males. And yet, that group, without representing everyone, is more accurate than polls that attempt to represent everyone. Just saying.
Can I just jump in on that maybe just for a second and see what Bernard or Joanne might think, or you as well? That when you mentioned that, let's say, contemporary sociologists are trying to use data from Twitter, or they can buy the raw feed, for example, from Twitter now if you want to. But what seems maybe more important there is a kind of unexpected emergence of a kind of corporate sociology that's tied very much to their own technologies, but also their own goals of prediction and confirmation. And they're always fine-tuning that, and it's always very proprietary. And meanwhile, we have algorithmic predictive systems, say, in law enforcement and terrorism, NSA kind of style things. That what we're really talking about is not just an academic, let's say, a gap between the academic kind of knowledge that used to be functioning in this traditional way, and we know that we don't have access in some ways to the data that is probably the most interesting sociologically, but also that those corporations in particular are also not tied to traditional legal and political limitations, so that they're making decisions about people are very accurate, but also skirt the law because the algorithms are finding data in all sorts of different places. So I just wonder if that is a sort of more ominous version of this problem that you're raising. That we're, and I know that Jen and I are in this algorithms group, so I'm sort of pushing that problem a little bit here. Is that the corporations actually are very good at modeling and predicting, but it's through things like market behaviors and buying things, and they're also shaping that by transforming the experiences all the time. So I know Bernard probably has something to say about that too, but I think it's an interesting angle on that.
Well, the first thing that breaks through my mind is interviewing job candidates in school of information who do big data work. And this is less true now than it was 10 years ago, but 10 years ago, the rising stars in the field that we would interview, we would ask them, what is this work good for? And they would always say, it's good for better targeting of ads. And actually, that was the end of the answer. There's not this and many other things.
Now, question of performativity in all those questions. That is for me very, very important. And that is very specific according to the disciplines, because you talked about poles for elections. The pole is producing something, the election is producing something very different sometimes, and the election is reality, the pole is anticipation. But the pole has an effect on this reality. So the question is a relationship between those performativities. It is performative to give a vote for Trump or Clinton. It is performative to answer a poll, an inquiry in a poll. But what are the relationships between those performativities? And it is not at all the same question in sociology, for example, or in politics, and in astrophysics, climate change. So, for example, if we don't address in the academic sphere particularly, the status and the function of such an institution like the IPCC, in our practice of knowledge, we don't do our job. We don't take our responsibilities, because such an instrument is interesting only if we are capable to have a policy for its performativity. If it's not only a question of evaluating the truth it is producing, it is wrong, because the question is not truth. It is not truth in the classical sense of science. It is truth precisely in the processual understanding of truth, that is, as individuation. So, and as distribution of knowledge, as understood as care, that is, as a responsibility that is a distributed one. And I think around this question of the climate change, for which now so many people are really anxious and are really concerned by the problem, even those who say it's not a problem. Because when they say it's not a problem, it is because they believe it is. And it is named denegation. And it's very well known, this process. I think now it is a moment for that. And we are confronted also with the question of data science and the transformation by algorithms, etc., of our practices for research, also for teaching, etc. It's a very big moment. It is a kairos, in the sense of the Greeks, for investigating these questions and for proposing a completely new type of critical theory, in which the question is to redefine what is critics. And we discussed yesterday about critics and negativity, but we had also the same discussion in Socrates. And I think today we have to produce what I call myself a hypercritic, in which we have also a critic phase, and we are entering into a critical phase. And critic becomes here a meta function in the movement, in the evolution through the critic phase, critical phase.
On the question of processuality and punctuality in knowledge processes in the IPCC, I think that's a really important point. A few years ago, I had this small conversation with Naomi Oreskes about working group 1 of the IPCC, which is the one that does the science work, the physical science of climate change, the parts that I was showing today. And the question was, maybe this part, so there are two other working groups, and they focus on the human impacts, environmental impacts of climate change, and on the one hand, how you might mitigate it or reduce it or change the course of it somehow. And the question was, maybe we should just abandon it, just stop, declare victory, move on. But what the conversation was kind of about this issue of what the role of that performance is. And the problem is that, in this country especially, it's also true in France, but that continuing to kind of rehearse the, is it really happening, how much do we know about it, what are the levels of uncertainty are there, creates openings for the skeptic discourse to come in and take over. That's one problem. But on the other hand, we do keep learning more, and we want want to put that out there and have that be part of the ongoing process of negotiation. So there's one comment I wanted to make. And the other is about the Paris COP21 is core to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Because the great, I went to that meeting and took a bunch of our students with me. And the great worry about the agreement is, of course, that now that it exists, that that's a kind of punctual moment at which it seemed as if we might be on the way to some sort of solution. And yet it's really only the very beginning. There's not a single country in the world that is on track to meet the targets it set for the Paris Agreement. I take it back. There are a few, but they're not the big ones, not the ones that really are going to matter in the long run. So we have there too an issue of the long process that comes to a final point where it seems like there's an agreement and then people just drop it. So 5 years later, we're going to revisit the agreement and see where things stand. My prediction is that there won't have been a tremendous change. Most countries will still not be on target for meeting those goals in 5 years.
Yeah, maybe we can take some questions too and see. It's kind of a sudden invitation. So.
Hi, I was struck by how the talk, the talk yesterday and today, both are kind of trying to recuperate some elements of what I would call kind of techno-utopian ideas with either the technosphere that Kevin Kelly wrote about and what technology wants, and yesterday the idea of the singularity. So I would be interested in hearing anything, any additional comments on kind of what elements you are taking from those ideas and what you would want to leave behind. Just to throw out one potential starting point. One thing that I think is really important, at least for ideas like the singularity, is that growth curve, which has kind of a performative effect itself. And yeah, so like the way it's used in Moore's law, and then to extrapolate to a whole bunch of other things. So I'm wondering how things might look different if we think about maybe using other kind of curves as models, like a logistical curve that looks exponential in one part of it, but if you broaden the time scale, looks different, or the Lotka-Volterra curves, which are also exponential for one part, but not
I will discuss the question of the curve. That is a very important question, of course. Maybe I will let Paul discuss this question if he wants. But the relationship I have myself to these utopic discourses on the change, on the shift, and the bifurcation of singularity. It is a very important question. And I think, as we say in French, I think you say that also in English, there is no smoke without fire. And I think the strength of the discourse of singularity is that they are capable to designate something that everybody feels to come, to arrive. And they are performative, precisely, because they create performatively, suddenly, a kind of what I call myself, by using the vocabulary of phenomenology, a production. That is a process of anticipation, transforming this anticipation into a will, or also fear, or also into affects that are capable to create a body, a social body. And of course, you probably understood yesterday that I completely disagree with this view, but the problem is we first must address the reason for which they are right. At which level we must tell that they are right. And my answer is they are right because the question is exosomatization. They are wrong because exosomatization didn't appear in the 20th century. It was the beginning of the process of what Laura called hominization. So exosomatization is absolutely not something new. And the question of singularity is not at all the question of the singularity of suddenly a process of exosomatization that would overcome our own possibilities, because it was always already the case too. This is the reason for which I try to theorize what I call the doubly epochal redoubling. I try to show, for example, that the printing press was provoking something completely overcoming the possibilities of its time, and this produced 20 million people killed by the wars, religion wars, not only that. So it's absolutely not new. But when saying that, I don't say that there is nothing new, of course. There is something absolutely new. And there are many things absolutely new. But the first one is that today, exosomatization can become a process of evolution controlled completely by the market. And this is completely new. And this is the strategy of the singularity, to increase the legitimacy for being the prescriptor of this evolution, and for making the artificial selection that doesn't appear now, that was appearing with the beginning of the exosomatization 3 million years ago, even 15 million years ago, because it began with the apes. It started with the apes. Now, when I say that, I think, and I try to convince you that, according to this, we have to completely reinterpret the, let's call that, patrimony of science, knowledge, etc. We have to completely, for example, revisit what was said about ethnography in the 19th century. We have to completely revisit the status of mathematics in the process of exosomatization. What is the role and the function of mathematics in this process of exosomatization? If we say, with Whitehead, that knowledge is a function of the consciousness, and if we agree, for example, with Lotka for saying that knowledge appears with exosomatization, the function of knowledge is to produce such an exosomatization that is sustainable, that is capable to maintain what I called yesterday, not exactly negentropy, but neganthropology. That is a future, an openness, the possibility for new bifurcations. So, this is the reason for which I said that we have to produce a new type of critique, a hypercritique, in which exactly at the contrary, in the contrary of what was said by Adorno, we not denounce the process of exosomatization, for example, of transcendental imagination into Hollywood, like we said with Horkheimer, but we'll say, no, if Hollywood is possible, it is because we have to criticize completely Kant and the whole history of science for showing that it was already at the beginning, for example, in the Upper Paleolithic, the process of exteriorization of imagination was the production of paintings, rupestral paintings, that constituted the process of imagination. And this is the stake of what Georges Pompidou said in Lascaux and the birth of art. So I think there is a possibility to take what is happening with the singularity as an object of critique, and to make this an advantage for us. For the moment, we are in disadvantage. knowledge, because when I say we, I say the academics, the classical sphere of those institutions in which we work. But I think it is provisional. We can change completely this situation. But this needs us to completely readdress what is critique today. And saying that, I say also that we must overcome the critique of critique, for example, by the lines, etc. Because it was necessary at this time. But now it's absolutely insufficient for facing with what is happening. That is really a state of emergency.
And just to supplement, it seems like the other plane that they're right is singularity with the capital S, is not just the market, but the automaticity of those market forces, the increasingly mysterious, alien, algorithmic performances of the axiosomatic process that makes it very difficult to challenge, but also more important.
Yeah. Here Kelly is interesting, because Kelly says we need a new theory. It is not at all the end of theory, it is the re-beginning of theory. And this is interesting, even if I don't agree with Kelly on the things. But
on the curves, I just want to, that's a great point. And of course, in the words of somebody I once heard talk about this, a trend is a trend, but when will it end? All trends end at some point, and that's true of Moore's law and lots of other curves too. And, one thing that we are seeing right now is that there's been this Moore's law function with respect to the price of photovoltaic panels, of course, made from the same material, silicon. And that's it's really a remarkable thing, and we don't see the end of it yet, but it will at some point. Another kind of, I don't know how to make this connection, but the concept of these, especially the decreasing cost and increasing performance of renewable energy sources, it's great news in a lot of ways. They are at price parity or better in probably 2/3 of the markets of the world right now. So that's an amazing thing. And it means that in the near future, I mean, in fact, in many places, they've already grown much faster than every other kind, all the fossil sources that exist, and nuclear too. So that's great, but at the same time, there are a couple of things to point out. One is that just because we are seeing an exponential increase in renewable energy doesn't mean that we will soon be at a place where most of our energy comes from renewable sources, because the fraction of the total is very small. So it has a long way to go to catch up. There are lots of other things. I tend to think about this from an infrastructural point of view. The world's fossil fuel infrastructure is worth about $10 trillion. That's about the GDP of the United States for a single year. So what that means is that if you were going to replace it overnight, it would cost at least that much, if you could even do it. And where would you get that kind of money in the world? So just as a matter of economics, it's really difficult to do. But even more importantly, there is so much habit and investment, and not of an economic sort, but a psychological and social sort, in the infrastructures that we have for gasoline, coal-fired power plants, and everything else, that those forces slow our ability to make that transition too. So, I hear a lot of the eco-modernist stuff as we've just got to get, we've got to do what technology wants. We've got to get better at making this much more efficient system that will do all the same things for us, but more cheaply and without relying on fossil fuels. That's, it's kind of like saying, we'll get out of this climate change problem by just putting our foot on the accelerator and going even faster, doing what we're already doing. So there's there are kind of inherent problems for me in that eco-modernist approach. But at the same time, what we're doing, leaving it alone, continuing on the course we're going right now is going to produce a complete catastrophe, is producing, has already things that is really far too often ignored in the climate change discussion is that there's immense inertia and delay in the climate system. So that even if we could stop releasing all greenhouse gases tomorrow, the climate would still keep warming for at least 100 years, and probably for centuries beyond that. Because there's the atmosphere and the oceans have to come into equilibrium before you get a stable climate. The atmosphere is way out of whack. The oceans, most of the heat that's been absorbed in the last few decades has been going into the top layer of the ocean. It's starting to circulate downward. And until the whole ocean is affected by that warming, you won't have an equilibrium. It's already built into the system, that inertia. So it's kind of a rambling answer. But I want to say something about the techno-utopian idea. And for me, so there's the Kevin Kelly technosphere, but the technosphere that I was talking about is a different one. It's a techno-dystopian view, in which half's version of the technosphere says, look, we've got this thing that already consumes an appreciable fraction of all the energy the planet receives in a single over time from the sun. It's already doing that. We're getting most of it from fossil sources. We would like to switch to other sources, but if you're at 30% already, that's a really tall order to do that. And then you run into other kinds of curves, like the Jevons paradox, that, okay, we will produce energy more cheaply, we'll have much more of it, it'll all be abundant, and we won't have to burn anything to get it. What does that do to us? Well, the first thing it does is say to you, oh, now I can do the same thing more, or I can do new things. Look at the internet, what's been going on with it. The reason for that kind of exponential curve in energy consumption in the internet. We started with sharing text, which is really tiny little bits of data. We went to voice calls, which is bigger, and now we do video. And there will just be more of that kind of increasing consumption, increasing demand, as it gets cheaper and cheaper to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been really interested to see this whole singularity thing kind of take root and take off. And I'm struck by how much it makes me think of millenarianism, this kind of millenarianism for scientists. And maybe also this, the narrative you're talking about climate change, where there's this point in 1942 where this, which marks the beginning. There's sort of a cosmological sense to all of this, which I think mimics, things I've read about cargo cults and, some of the more kind of traditional anthropological records. Maybe what that suggests is that, this is a great space for anthropologists to be working, that kind of modern, non-modern divide, increasingly as, we've never been modern, we're really still not modern. I think that's something to think about. And I wonder how much of that, it's interesting to see these sort of narratives play out, and yet at the base of it are some, claims about hard science and facts and data and, a very careful process of collecting that kind of data. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else kind of was thinking this is millenarianistic thinking. Yeah, it's particularly the singularity, right? There's this kind of...
So is climate change.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me, sometimes I talk about this, the moment at which climate change becomes a big public issue is actually 10 years after the scientific consensus is first formed, which was about 1979. The moment is 1988, when Jim Hansen gives his famous talk before Congress and says it's 99% that humans are causing climate change. That just happens to be right around the end of the Cold War. So the moment is the time when the apocalypse of nuclear war is receding in the public imagination, and now there's a kind of apocalypse gap, which is easily filled by climate change.
Yeah, but would you agree that that's a kind of, what you called futuration yesterday, is like these are different versions of that process of futuration?
Yes, of course. Now, I wouldn't talk about millenarianism in this case. Of course, there are such kind of investment reactions that are always produced by such possibilities, like in the case of nuclear war. But in this case, it is different. Nevertheless, I think there are, of course, those reactions and classical repetitions, but there is also a situation that is really new, and our problem is precisely to make the departure between the two. And here, for me, the question is how works the process of denial and denegation. I think I tried, you didn't use the word disruption. I believe you are right, because it is a word very mainstream today. It's like Silicon Valley, discourse, vocabulary on singularity. Nevertheless, disruption is a process that is happening now, and I think in disruption it is very interesting to observe the different diverse attitudes and mechanisms, psychical and social mechanisms, by which some people, a lot of people, are first in denegation, after in not only denegation but reaction. Even, for example, the extreme right in France is a reaction, not only against that, but it is also a reaction against this situation. And how can we transform these reactions into actions? This is the real question. And here, of course, there is a phantasmatic process. And nobody is capable to avoid such fantasy, because we are, all of us, submitted to that, because it is the effect of the really new situation for which we are without concepts, we are without methods, without institutions, without means, for example, transformation of the infrastructures, etc. We are in a situation that is really a situation of confrontation with the limits. And we have to transform that into what I call myself really a quasi-causal appropriation of the situation. And this is what I tried to say when I said that we have to really we have to appropriate the discourse of singularity, not for telling the same discourse, but for taking it seriously to account and to transform it into a really critical theory or conceptualization. So here one very important problem is the psychopathological question. You can see that symptomatology of Trump, for example, or Hollande également, if you have a small interest for what happens in France, I recommend you to read the newspapers for yesterday and today about what Hollande said about justice in France. It was a kind of political suicide. And for me, it is a case of madness, of pure madness, but it is an effect of what we say. Because it is the production of the process of denial that is produced in France by the very specific organization of the National School of Administration. But because Hollande comes from this school. But there you can find the same problems in Italy. You can find those problems in Asia, in Japan, etc. It is a world, a problem we can see everywhere in the world. The psychopathologies are not the same, but in all these cases, you have problems of psychopathologies. And this is very information. In my last book, I reread the book by Foucault, L'histoire de la folie, history of madness. It is madness. in the classical age, because it was very interesting to see what he quoted in the age, for example, the 14th and 15th century. That was also a sudden increasing of mad behavior, but very different today. And I think we are confronted with such a situation. And what is interesting for me, it is not simply a morbid interest for madness, even if I am interested in my own madness, but through this work. But it is what links madness and noises. This was a stake for Foucault. And the big disagreement between Foucault and Derrida began around this question of the status of madness into noises. The two agreed for saying that the condition of noises is madness, because the condition of noises is what I called yesterday hubris in the sense of the Greeks. And this is hubris that produces madness. What is Sophocles, for example, or tragic Greek tragedy in general? It is the expression and I don't find a term for making the city appropriating this destiny, this fate that is, we are, I said myself today, are exosomatized organisms, necessarily confronted to madness. But there are times in which we can ignore that. For example, the 18th century completely ignored this. This is the reason for which Voltaire said that he excluded completely madness from reason, and reason was exactly the contrary of madness. And it was not at all what said Descartes. Here I agree with Derrida. So we are now confronted with such a situation because we are confronted to a tragic fate at the global level. And if you go, myself I teach in China, with my students in Nanjing are extremely sensible to this question, like my students in Europe or in America, everywhere we find that. Not in the same way, but everywhere. So I think, yes, there is a question of pathology, and also in the sense of that we have also to redefine what is pathos, and what is the function of the pathos, because the strength of Stiegler is to explain that there is a function of pathos, not only in the noetic form of life, but in life in general. And I think here we are now confronted to these questions, but at a huge level, a completely new one.
So we'll take maybe one more question. Oh, sorry. Let's see where it is. Hi.
I don't know, given the context now, if this is, anyway. I was wondering what you all thought of the usefulness of the term Capitalism to replace the Anthropocene at this moment. It seems to have gotten a lot of legs, at least in the US, and I myself am pretty conflicted about it, but I just was wondering what you all thought in relationship to other things that you were saying.
I haven't heard that, capitalism. I mean, I think I'm struck by the assumption that capitalism is something that can be handled in one word as kind of a homogeneous force. That would be my immediate response to that term. Anthropocene seems a little bit more useful.
I've thought about this some. It's useful in the sense that it points to a cause, not just to an effect. But on the other hand, I mean, there is no world with 9 billion people in it under any technological or economic system that is going to be sustainable. So it's not just a matter of the economic system we have. Certainly there could be better ones, and absolutely there could be more equitable ones, and that would be a huge step in the right direction. But if you look at the standard of living of people, half the planet, they want to have a standard of living that is more like the one here. And even if we somehow manage to have unbelievably efficient technology that didn't release so much emissions, it still can do a lot of damage. So I don't see that as an answer. It might be a start in the right direction.
Myself, I think it is interesting, but it is not sufficient. And I would not say that the Anthropocene is capitalism, but I would say that the Anthropocene has a Capitalism side that is very important. Why? Because in what we call the Anthropocene, if we follow, for example, this is what you, not what you said exactly yourself, but people say generally Anthropocene begins with the Industrial Revolution, industrial capitalism. This process of production of the Anthropocene is made possible by computation, calculation. It is the status of compute, of calculation in the life, as it was described by Karl Polanyi, that makes possible such an evolution. I believe that myself. Now, and when you talk about dignitized, the question of the status of computation and calculation. Now, the question of computation is not reducible to the question of capitalism, of course. So, it is an interesting view, but it is not sufficient. And the real question for me is with this thesis that capitalism, Anthropocene is capitalism, is that it dissimulates the question, the cosmological question that there is. And here we have a question of cosmology. This is also the reason for which I read myself Whitehead, because he reintroduced the question of cosmology into astrophysics. And it's not possible, in my opinion, to suppress the question of cosmology. What is the question of cosmology? It is a question of locality. And the question of locality is a question that we have to address if we take seriously the theory of negative entropy, or etc. And that is the specificity of life into the process of the universe. And here we are confronted now to a cosmological question. This is also the reason for which Duke is now publishing a book on the Chinese cosmology and relationship to technology. And I think we are rediscovering this question of locality, and also the question of locality in the sense of Aristotle, etc. This is also the reason for which I read René Thom. We discussed that yesterday, because René Thom was a mathematician addressing these questions in terms of topography, the theory of catastrophe, etc. And we have to completely requalify these questions.
Let me build on that a little bit, because I think you're absolutely right. It's a cosmological question. The way I would put it is that the usefulness of the idea of the Anthropocene is what it's going to do to other forms of, to all forms of knowledge. Because what it says to us is that scale is the central issue of knowledge in our time. So time scale, especially, Clive Hamilton likes to say social scientists have to become geophysicists. We cannot ignore everything that went before. And what everything that went before means now is on the order of millions of years. It's not on the order of centuries or decades or something like that. And this is true for history as well, and for every other field, that rethinking how we think about what the world is, what the home that we dwell in is, and how we're going to continue to survive in it is really, it has to be everywhere. It's not a thing that can just be a sideline for some small group.
And picking up on that issue of scale, I study the internet, which could mean many things. But I think one thing I've seen that's very interesting among people who study the internet is from this idea that this is a virtual kind of immaterial space, to start to confront the physicality of the internet and its material fundamentals, and some of what Paul presented on that supply chain, those issues about the source material that goes into a mobile phone, and that cloud computing is the 6th largest consumer in the world. I think all that relates to scale. So the internet as ARPANET, a network of like a dozen computers is, sure, you can talk about it in terms as being immaterial or virtual in terms of the speed of light of how information is being sent and received. But when you're talking about the internet we have now and the seemingly immaterial videos that are being transported everywhere, and then you start to look at data centers and their energy consumption and their water usage, it becomes very clear that's impactful, certainly on the environment, and that has some material consequences to our planet.
Even though there's always this dissimulation of the cloud metaphor, which I
Yeah.
use in my class, and you see the images, and everything is just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Great. Do we have one more question? Okay.
Thanks. Can I ask a question for Stiegler? A question about critique, something that you just mentioned a bit earlier. And something striking, you said that the critiques, let's say, of Derrida and Deleuze are not adequate at time. And hearing what you spoke about yesterday and hearing you now, and also from reflecting on your writing, is by this critique, do you mean a critique of metaphysics? Is there a kind of legacy, a Heideggerian legacy to this, such that, as you know, for Heidegger, metaphysics has kind of a legacy that goes back to Plato, and it gets, let's say, reified through modernity. What do you mean by this critique? What does the performance of this critique mean for you? And does it have this kind of this legacy that goes back to the critique of metaphysics?
It's a big question. The base of my discourse here is the critique of critique, the critique of Kant, concerning the status of transcendental imagination. In the first edition of Critique of Pure Reason, and its interpretation by Heidegger. As you know, the theory of Heidegger concerning metaphysics is based on an interpretation of the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And for me, this interpretation that is published, that was published under the title Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, is extremely strong and describes something that, in my opinion, Heidegger himself doesn't see when he explains what Kant calls three syntheses of imagination in the transcendental deduction of categories. What he shows is that the first synthesis of apprehension is what is described by Husserl as the process of aggregation of primary relations. The second synthesis is what is called synthesis of reproduction, is what Husserl described as secondary relations, that is memories. And the third one is recognition as protections. So I believe that Heidegger shows that, but he doesn't see that he shows that for me. And since myself, I try to show that at the end of his work, Husserl, after Weissenstein, and after the critique of the Kant and the problem of metaphysics, Husserl explained that there is no geometry possible without a third type of retention, that is what he calls writing. We have to revisit and to re-qualify what Heidegger said of Kant, and what we have to think about these transcendental deduction of categories by Kant, and we have to introduce as a fourth synthesis what I call the synthesis of reproduction, not reproduction, but reproduction. I produced this concept before that for explaining what was the stake of Benjamin analysis of techniques and technology. And I say that because what I call hypercritique, it is a new critique based on the critique of critique. I think we have to reinvest, for example, all the work by Heidegger, by Derrida, by Deleuze, also Foucault, from such a point of view that themselves were not able to address. Strangely, because, for example, Deleuze is always extremely close to that, with his concept of machine, of capitalism,
Body without organs.
with a body without organs, etc. But why? I don't know exactly. It was not ready. It was not the epoch for producing that. Now we are obliged, because we are confronted with this question absolutely at all the levels of knowledge, and in the everyday life, not only academic knowledge, but everyday life knowledge. For example, our mobility is transformed by that, etc. But everything. So here, critique is the definition of a new question of limits. So it is, I would not say neo-Kantian, because I'm not at all neo-Kantian. For example, Cassirer was neo-Kantian. I think we must read Cassirer because he said interesting things, blah, blah. But it's not a neo-Kantian position, it is a post-Kantian position, where we say we reinvest the investments of Kant himself, but in a point of view that could not be the one, the point of view of Kant. And that was not the point of view of Deleuze, Derrida, etc. Because Heidegger and Freud, who were their main sources of inspiration, couldn't address these questions. Now, this question of limits is the one of the question of what I call exosomatization. Before I called that process of exteriorization or externalization in the sense of lower one, but I discovered 4 years ago Georges Pompidou, and he produces very, very, very provocative hypotheses that are very short. You can read this, it's 70 pages, but it's extremely provocative. And he produced that in the 70s, and when we read that now, it's extremely impressive to see how it is relevant. So this is what I try to think as what I call a hypercritic, but such an hypercritic is not, this is what I said also yesterday, it is not a negative apprehension of the situation, it's not at all a denunciation, not at all a denunciation or denouncement. It is a discernment, and it is Deleuzian, let's say, in the sense in which it is quasi-causal. It is made for making possible a process of appropriation of the fate. It is amor fati in the sense of Nietzsche, if you want.
Great. Well, I think we've reached our time, so I just wanted to thank everyone for making this such a great event, especially our panelists and our speakers for the last 2 days. Thank you for coming, and thanks to Lara Wolf for helping to organize, and Milky as well for organizing this great afternoon. So thanks everyone, and thanks.
Thank you.